Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the media, uh, colleagues of the Working People's Alliance. Welcome to this press conference of the Working People's Alliance, WP. It is now 11 o'clock, and at the head table we have Doctors David Hines, Professor David Hines, presidential candidate of the Working People's Alliance. We have Dr. Dennis Canterbury, executive member of the Working People's Alliance, and Brother Takumo Gonsi, executive member and co-leader of the Working People's Alliance. Welcome to this press conference, and we'll start with Professor David Hines reading the party's press statement.
Good morning, members of the media. Thank you, Brother Kaki. The Working People's Alliance wholeheartedly supports the recommendation by Elder Wpa that the government's recent $100,000 cash grant to each voter be taken to the National Assembly for full debate and passage into law. Indeed, the WPA's cash transfer proposal, in the form of the Buxton proposal, calls for such payments to be sanctioned by legislation. Like Elder Kwayano, we feel that a policy of this magnitude should not be left to the whims and fancies of the executive branch. Second, given the range of opinion on this policy, the proper democratic approach is subjected to the widest debate and scrutiny by the elected representatives of the people. Further, Guyana's constitution gives ultimate control of the national purse strings to the legislative branch. Article 217, Section 4 of Guyana's constitution clearly states, and I quote, "No monies shall be withdrawn from any public fund other than the consolidated fund unless the issue of those monies has been authorized by or under an act of parliament." End of quote. It is WPA's considered view that since the cash grant in question was not part of the 2024 budget, it is a violation of the Constitution to proceed with its implementation without legislative approval. The executive is not the legislative branch of government. As Elder Kwayana observes, and I quote, "To some of my generation, not brainwashed by the British, but growing up in the tradition that Parliament is the controller of the public purse. Ultimately, this is an amazing development, not a piece of legislation. How will the Auditor General pronounce this distribution when it takes place?" End of quote. WPA therefore condemns, in the strongest terms, the government's decision to proceed with implementing the grant without legislative cover. We view the decision as articulated by Vice President Jack Bill at his most recent press conference as yet another brazen autocratic act, a form of governance that has been normalized by this government. It is a grave manifestation of executive lawlessness and tyranny that has no place in a democratic order. His explanation that legislation would impose rigid, recurrent expenditures on the executive is at best nonsensical. It exposes the Vice President's unfamiliarity with how the law works, in particular, the relationship between the law and the economy. Further, it ominously betrays a worrying disrespect for the rule of law, something that should be resisted by all Guyanese. WPA reiterates its belief that all cash grants or transfers must be grounded in legislation. This is part of a long tradition of democratic practice that is even more needed in this new oil and gas dispensation. In fact, we believe that any new legislation should also give retroactive cover to previous cash grants. WPA takes this opportunity to register its abhorrence of Vice President Jack Deo's continued use of his constitutional office to hurl insults at the government's critics, including women, and at media operatives. In this instance, we note with much consternation his recent attacks on the integrity of Elder Kwayana and Professor Clive Thomas. Instead of addressing the issues raised by these two eminent Guyanese citizens, the Vice President resorted to slandering them and misrepresenting their views. His characterization of Kwayana as being part of a WPA racial cabal is a nasty attack on someone who has dedicated his long political life to fighting against injustice, including racial and ethnic injustice. Mr. Jack Deo, on the other hand, has spent his political career presided over institutional racism, in particular, political racial assassinations and racially driven discrimination against African Guyanese workers and citizens. WPA serves notice to the Vice President that his attacks on our leaders will not go unanswered. Jack Deo's misrepresentations and downright lies about Professor Clive Thomas represents a new low in political discourse. For example, his declaration that Thomas presided over the closure of Gaisuko sugar estates and the consequent firing of thousands of sugar workers is a figment of his demented imagination. For the record, Professor Thomas, in concert with the Commission of Inquiry on the sugar sector, into the sugar sector, recommended that no estates should be closed. Jack Deo, also in an effort to misrepresent the Buxton proposal, falsely and maliciously claims that Thomas wants to give $1 million to every Guyanese citizen. Anyone who has been following the issue knows that the Buxton proposal proposes that sum of money, or the equivalent of 10% of the annual oil revenues, be given to each household. Free and fair elections. From the time of its birth in 1974, WPA has been an ardent proponent of free and fair elections as central to Guyana's political architecture and political culture. We regret that after almost 6 decades of independence, we still have not been able to construct a national electoral machinery that is acceptable to all stakeholders. The 2020 elections demonstrated how fragile that machinery is, a fact that was acknowledged by many of the foreign observers. Unfortunately, the PPP has resisted all attempts to correct the situation. The party's resistance to cleaning the voters list and introducing biometrics in an effort to reduce the potential for voter fraud is tantamount to holding the country at ransom. The constant excuses run counter to the ruling party's rhetoric in favor of free and fair elections. WPA warns that if this issue is not resolved, the coming election could well be a trigger for political instability. We do not see how there can be much confidence in an election with a voters list that is equal to the size of the population. Nothing short of a new list bereft of the bloat will suffice. Further, given the documented instances of voter impersonation unearthed by the 2020 recount and confirmed by immigration authorities, the use of enhanced biometrics is urgently needed. WPA therefore supports the stance of the three opposition appointed GCOM commissioners in relation to the above stated issues. We call for a brand new voters list that results from fresh house-to-house registration. Given the ruling of the courts in relation to the removal of citizens from the current list, the parties must pass legislation to facilitate this exercise. We also support the introduction of biometrics. The Attorney General's recent excuse that power failure could interfere with the technology is nothing short of scandalous. In any case, WPA is informed that the technology is insulated against power failures. WPA also registers its concern over the repeated instances of GCOM chair voting with the government-appointed commissioners to thwart solutions to these problems. This flies in the face of the principle of an independent chair. WPA finds this development unacceptable and calls on the Madam Chair to adopt the Surajbali formula of consensus decision-making with the use of the casting vote as an absolute last resort. Failure to move in this direction, WPA would have to join the calls for our resignation. WPA is concerned about the charges of politicization of GCOM staff. This is a crucial area of the electoral machinery. The charges of hiring staff who are considered favorable to one party or the other must not be taken lightly. In this regard, WPA calls for an independent audit of the existing staff to determine their neutrality in the conduct of their official responsibilities. We also support Commissioner Vincent Alexander's recommendation that future hiring process be conducted by an independent committee rather than the GCOM commissioners. Finally, WPA calls on the international observer groups and the wider international community to exert pressure on the government to change course. While we frown on interference in the internal affairs of our country, we recognize that Guyana is part of a larger global community, and its governors should be held accountable to universal governance standards. Referendum on the 2016 PSA. WPA notes recent calls for a referendum on the 2016 oil contract. While we do not oppose such a move, we strongly feel that such a referendum must also cover the distribution of the oil resources to the people and the form of governance to be adopted as we transition into a petro state. It is our view that the three issues are interrelated. We cannot separate the government's contract with oil companies from its social political contract with the people of Guyana. Our support for such a referendum is therefore conditional. First, WPA recommends that the 2016 oil contract, the Buxton proposal, and shared governance be put on the ballot. Second, there must be consensus on the questions being put to the electorate in order to avoid the exercise becoming a partisan political football and an ethno-racial census. WPA stands with the residents of Oxtyle, Lancaster. WPA stands with the residents of Oxtyle, Lancaster in their resistance to the government's decision to install a canal in close proximity to a residential area and in violation of the villagers' land rights. WPA feels that while citizens should welcome infrastructural development, it should not be at the expense of their safety and their livelihood. The government's decision to proceed with this project without consultation with the villagers is a flagrant violation of their citizen rights to decide on matters that relate to their safety and their livelihood. This decision also shows that the government has not learned any lesson from the experiences of Mocha and Petersall. End of statement. Thank you.
Yes, Dennis Shabral, Damara Waves. Can you hear me? Yeah. Dr. Hines, you noted the contents of the Commission of Inquiry report recommending no closure of the estates. But what is your view today about the sugar industry, given the fact that today we are seeing reports of heavy financial losses by Gaisuko? Do you still hold to that view that the estates should not have been closed, in keeping with that recommendation by the COI?
Well, I mean, times have changed and moved on, and we haven't given any in-depth study to where the industry is at the moment. But we hold very strong to the view that when you are engaging in matters such as the right sizing of the sugar industry, you have to be very careful not to harm the workers in the industry. And so it was that thinking that drove Dr. Thomas not to recommend the closure of the estates. We do, however, continue to believe that it is not sustainable to maintain the industry in the way it is being maintained with large subsidy from the government. We cannot continue to produce sugar at the high price that is being produced. In effect, what we are doing and what we continue to do is to subsidize those who buy our sugar. Because if sugar is on the world market, I think it's about, I don't know, 12 cents now per pound, and we are producing at about $12, sorry, we are producing about 40 cents per pound. And it's being sold on the market at 12 cents per pound. Then what we are in effect doing is subsidizing the people who are buying our sugar. And we think that that is not sustainable. We are not surprised that the industry continues to be in trouble. We are not surprised at that. And we feel the time has come for another look at where the industry is and to see what changes need to be made at present. So, yes, we recognize that there is trouble in the industry. There continues to be trouble. But as a party, we are not guided by decisions that are made off the top of our heads. We supported a commission of inquiry a decade ago, and we would not hesitate to support another commission of inquiry to see where the industry is at the moment and to make recommendations for the necessary changes.
How do you rationalize that? Right. So, Dr. Hines, how do you rationalize your position now that the industry is indeed making losses with the fact that the COI at that time recommending no closure? I mean, ultimately, what's the solution?
Well, like I said, the solution is to make the industry a profit-making enterprise and not a burden on the government. And as we have often said, we have to be very careful when we're dealing with an industry that is so rooted in the culture and the politics of the country. And so there is no one solution. And that is why we are saying that we would support another commission of inquiry to see where the industry is at the moment and to see whether closure is an option. No, as you noted, when this government came back in, it basically agreed with the Commission of Inquiry that it is going to be very difficult to maintain the industry based on the subvention that we have, and that it would reopen the estates. It took a long while before they reopened the estates. And I think what they're banking on is that the windfall that we're getting from oil, they're transferring that to the sugar industry. Well, that in itself is not sustainable. That would lead to the so-called Dutch disease that they mentioned, where we are taking money and depending a lot on the oil and gas and then taking it to subsidize another industry. So yes, we would not sit here and say that we have the solutions to the problem. As I said, we would be guided by another commission of inquiry to advise the government as to what the next step should be.
I just want to add to remind the press and the nation that Dr. Thomas and the commission had recommended that we have a meeting of all the national stakeholders to discuss and to come to an agreement on the future of the estates, because they felt it was very important national asset and it had a very important historical, social, and political history behind it, and that we had to be extremely careful that we handle it in a way that at the end of the day, the nation will benefit. And people must remember that the commission also recommend a holistic policy of diversification of the industry into other areas of activity. So we in the WPA has always been very conscious that Gaisuco cannot survive in its present structure with all the estates, but at the same time, when we decide to right-size the estates, we had an obligation to do it in a way that brings as little as possible hurt and discomfort to the working people. And that is our position now, and will remain our position in the future. Whatever approaches we take, And we have to do something about sugar, but we should try our best not to have too much of hurt and disruption of ordinary working people's life.
Do you have any initial thoughts, Mr. Ogunse, as to how this can be achieved?
But I think the first requirement for that is a political solution to the country governance structure. I am convinced, and I think the WPA is convinced, that these hard national issues are best addressed if we are concerned about outcomes in an atmosphere of political reconciliation and shared governance.
I just want to ask again, Dr. Hines, what do you make of Gaisuko's continued silence on the state of the sugar industry as of now? The corporation has not said anything despite repeated calls by the media.
Well, it is obviously, I mean, Gaisuko, in our circumstances, will follow the line of the government. And this government has not been transparent in its dealings with the Guyanese people. It is now customary that the government does things without consultation. That's one. Second, it does not report in a timely manner to the people. And thirdly, is contempt for the media itself. And so therefore, the silence of Gaisuko is a reflection of the normalization of the governance of silence. But it also reflects perhaps an admittance and embarrassment on the part of Gaisuko leadership that the previous government was right, that the industry needed a complete overhaul. And I think they've reached that point now. And it may be a form of embarrassment that they're not speaking up for fair, that if they were to do so, they would be echoing the very conclusions of the Commission of Inquiry and the larger conclusion of the coalition government. So I think we have reached a crossroads as far as the industry is concerned, and the government is not prepared to deal with it. I think they intend to ride out this Gaisuko crisis until the next election and hope, because remember, they depend a lot on the votes of sugar workers. And they, I think, intend to not make this an election issue for them. And so therefore, the silence is reflective of that tactical move to ride out until the elections. And they may, after the elections, make some drastic moves. I don't know. But that's our reading of the situation. We would like to expand, if you will, Brother Chair, a little more on the referendum that is now become part of the political discourse on the 2016 PSA. And as a party, we would not stand in the way of any move to include the wide masses of people in decision making. And referenda are intended as a form of direct democracy by the people. And so we would not stand in the way if there is consensus on a referendum to determine whether the contract should be renewed or not. But if must be said that we are adamant that that referendum on the renewal of the contract should be accompanied by a referendum on how oil revenues are spent. We feel that the two are interconnected, that one cannot argue for more revenues via the contract. And somebody. Yeah, there's some interruptions there. You don't have to go to church. You can listen to us today. Kibaki, I think it's coming from your end.
It's coming from my street, the pass.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. We feel that one cannot advocate for more revenues coming to the government by an improved contract and not advocate for those revenues to be distributed equitably and democratically. We think it's political dishonesty to separate the two. And so therefore, we would agree to a referendum on the PSA once there is a referendum on the Buxton proposal, for example, or some variation of the Buxton proposal. We also feel that there should be a referendum on governance, because the governance of the oil revenues coming in and how we manage the oil revenues is also tied to this whole new dispensation of the petrol state. In that regard, we feel shared governance should be put on the agenda as on the referendum, as Brother Takuma says, that at the bottom of all our difficulties is the question of a political consensus. Our present winner-take-all system puts one party in charge. And as we have already seen, it is dangerous, very dangerous, to have one party in charge of our oil and gas sector and the windfall that comes with that and how it's distributed. We also saw how dangerous it was for one party, whether it was the PPP or the coalition, to have negotiated the PSA by itself. The WPA would feel much more comfortable that when we go in to negotiating contracts in our oil sector, or any sector in our economy, that we do so as a collective. We do so as a united nation. And so therefore, the question of shared governance, we think is very, very important. At the last constitutional reform, the commission went around and listened to people, and almost every meeting it went to, people called for shared governance. The commission, controlled by the political parties, could not agree on shared governance. And so Article 13 of inclusive governance was a compromise. But Article 13 is not enforceable. And so therefore, we would welcome taking shared governance to the people for their sanction. So for us, it's a referendum on the oil contract, a referendum on the distribution of the resources, and we are proposing the Buxton proposal, which we think is the most comprehensive proposal that is on the table. And thirdly, a referendum on shared governance. We think that if we are going down that route and we were to address those three questions, it will pull our country a far way from the kind of acrimony that we now experience.
But Dr. Hines, already there is a view that the upcoming election can be complicated by a referendum. What's your response to that?
Well, we wouldn't go along with a referendum at the same time of the election. I know in countries such as the United States, they put those things on the ballot at election time. Our country does not have that kind of experience. And so therefore, it would be something new. We wouldn't want that to be at the same time as the election. We would support a referendum, however, before the election, so that the people will speak on these issues, and they will then vote for parties based on their stance on these issues. So no, we wouldn't go along with a referendum at the same time of the national and regional elections, but we would welcome such a referendum before the elections.
And how do you guard against a referendum being, well, I mean, it's a political process, but how do you guard against it being politically driven or tainted by political parties and other actors, so that they actually seek to decide or to virtually instruct the populace how to vote?
We are very glad for that question. We have had the experience in our Caribbean of the West Indies Federation and Jamaica's vote at the referendum to leave the federation, and that vote was heavily tainted by partisan considerations. In effect, the Jamaica Labour Party at that time was very much anti-integration, and the referendum became a party vote. Recently, we have had a referendum in Grenada and St. Vincent on the CCJ, and those referenda became a party vote. And so we are very much aware of the thin line between a party vote and a vote based on conscience. And that is why we said in the statement that I read today that the parties would have to sit down and to agree on the referendum for it to avoid partisan vote. There's such a thing as the wording. If you're going to do a referendum on the PSA, are you going to say, for example, should the 2016 PSA be renegotiated? Well, if that is the question, all parties will have to decide that that is the question, because some parties may feel that the question should not be put that way. And so you have to have consensus on the questions that are being put to avoid that eventuality. And even then, with consensus, people may still take their cue from political parties, because political parties could agree to a particular question and then turn against that question and instruct their supporters to vote a certain way. We should not put that past political parties. But if we're going to go down that road, the best way to avoid the thing becoming a political football is to have consensus before we go in to the referendum.
Good morning, Dr. Hines.
Good morning, Mark, and welcome. Village Voice, welcome.
Yes, sir. I have your last comments addressed something that was raised, an issue that was raised by a prominent political commentator recently. Another issue that was raised in the column by the same political observer is that a referendum my takeaway was that a referendum may undermine, a referendum would be direct representation by the citizens and may undermine the representation, within a republic that's not really within a republic. How would you respond to that concern, sir?
Yes, I think you're referring to Dr. Jeffrey's column. I don't know if
I am, sir.
Yes,
I am
yes.
referring to Dr. Jeffrey's column.
Right, I did read that column. I don't know, before I respond, if any of my colleagues would like to weigh in on the issue. Yes? No? Yeah, that is always a concern, representative democracy versus direct democracy, and whether direct democracy would undermine representative democracy. And theoretically, that is always a concern. But I think in the case of Guyana, where our representative democracy is already undermined by one-party governance, you see, one-party governance undermines our representative democracy because the opposition does not get a chance to represent its supporters in an effective way in the National Assembly. And so therefore, a resort to direct democracy may well be a counter to the hegemony of the ruling party in parliament. So in this instance, I think direct democracy via referendum could play a positive rather than a negative role in terms of undermining or not undermining representative democracy, because representative democracy itself has already been undermined.
Thank you, sir. That answers my question.
You're welcome. New source, any questions?
Oh, Dr. Hines, good day.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Okay. No, I will let Brother Ogun address the first part of the question. That is our position on coalition, and then I could probably deal with whether there have been any communication with the other two parties, the PNC and the AFC, in that regard.
The WPA has always been committed to coalition politics. Our affray into the electoral politics, we probably had contested 2 elections by ourselves. But after that, we have always been contesting with other political forces. But to fast track the issue, it is the WPA's commitment to electoral politics that give birth to the APNU and subsequently to the APMU plus AFC coalition. So we have invested, a lot of energies in building coalition politics in the country in a difficult situation where the culture among the masses and the political parties has not been sufficiently developed in this regard. So the fight for coalition or coalition politics have had its plus and it had its minus. And I think that everybody would agree that coalition politics brought the first defeat to the PPP after they ruled the country for 23 years uninterrupted. It gave birth to APMU AFC government, which had opened the door for hope in the country. And the APMU AFC government, it was not a perfect government. I think it's demonstrated the country's unfamiliarity with coalition politics in a very profound way. But we in the WPA, looking at the situation in Guyana, are convinced that going forward, we must have a united opposition based upon coalition politics to confront the PPP. We don't see any other alternative that stand a chance of defeating the PPP. So we are very much committed to that, and we are open to those discussions. We have had our experience, both positive and negative, which we will bring to bear in those coalition discussions, so that we could improve, the coalition going forward. But at the end of the day, we wanted to be clear to the nation that the WPA preference for the upcoming elections is for the opposition to go into those elections in a grand coalition. So our commitment to coalition politics is unquestionable.
Brother Rohit and our brother Dennis, would you like to add anything to what Brother Ogun said?
No, I think that Brother Ogun said it best.
Brother Rohit? You're muted. Yeah.
I think it's a well-known maxim that a house divided against itself will fall. And I think that sums up Guyana politics for 50 years. We have to find a formula for national unity, and I think that's what we're struggling for. The PPP had offered critical support to the PNC, and the PNC said it was more critical than supportive. So there again, we failed to find a solution to the national problem. With the oil economy, it was hoped that that would be a fundamental turning point. We wouldn't be fighting the politics of scarcity, but the politics of plenty. What we have seen now is the division of the national resource is falling along political divisions. So a national unity government is an imperative to solve the fundamental problems of Guyana. And I think that's where we must head in the short term as well as in the long term.
Yes, thank you, brothers. Our commitment to coalition politics is not as an end in itself. We see a coalition government as a means to the end, and the end is a national government. So we in no way believe that a coalition of opposition parties will solve our problems of representation, of national unity, of ethno-racial unity. And so therefore, we see an opposition coalition government as a means to an end. We want to make that patently clear. The second thing we want to make very, 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 very clear is that we know going into a coalition, again, does not allow our party to know its strength within the larger society. And as a third party, we always have to answer that question. What is your support? What is your support? Because at the end of the day, our elections is about winning, one party winning or the other. And so therefore, supporters of a quote unquote small party are more likely to be supportive of that small party, but give their vote to a larger party that they think has a better chance of winning the election. And so that thinking among the citizens, which we think is in many regards, is quite rational, given the winner-take-all system, says to us that a coalition is a better option than going by ourselves. The third thing I want to emphasize is that we do not believe that a minority government that is brought about by small parties splitting the votes of large parties is a solution to our problem. We have had a minority government after the 2011 election, and we saw what happened. That government continued to behave as though it was a majority government. And the only thing that held it back was the threat of a no confidence vote. And in the end, it was the threat of the no confidence vote that caused that government to go back to an election. The point I'm making here is that if you have a minority government, and that minority government is prepared to sit down with the other parties in the National Assembly and arrive at a modus operandi of governing together, then a minority party leading to a solution makes sense. But the political culture in our country doesn't allow for that. And so therefore, we do not support, as a small party, going into an election by ourselves, hoping to get our 2 or 3 seats and using that to bring the 2 parties together. I don't think our political culture, we do not believe that our political culture allows for that, and we were proven right after the 2011 elections. And so the rationale for coalition politics is grounded in those what we call political truisms. Now, as it relates to whether there have been talks among the parties, we are in constant contact at the leadership level with the PNC. Our party has appointed myself as the go-between with the other opposition parties. And I am in constant contact with Mr. Norton since he assumed the position. Our talks have been confined to a possible return of the WPA to the APNU and or a joint opposition grouping. We have not got to the point of talking about a coalition in the coming election yet. As it relates to the AFC, we have had one meeting at the leadership level. A delegation from our party met with the AFC leader at our request. And we discussed a couple of limited matters, which we would not want to divulge to the media at this time, with the promise that we would follow up. Again, at that level, the question of a coalition was not broached. So as we stand here now, we in the WPA we are building up our resources so that we can take to the streets and begin to talk about the issues that we feel should be part of an election campaign. And to build up our stocks, because we have had to answer that question in the previous coalition as what do you bring to the table? As the media knows, we have used our two social media platforms, Camps TV and Politics 101, to partly advance the WPA position and to keep in touch with the wider masses of people. But we recognize that that is not enough, and that we should take to the streets in the traditional way. And we have had an infusion of a major resource in recent times, which would allow us to go to the streets and to put before the people our political platform. We hope that the other two major parties, which have said that they're doing the same thing, that sooner rather than later, there could be some talks about a possible coalition. We are clear. Our first resort is to go as a coalition. And our very last resort is to go by ourselves into the election. We feel that the PPP has made it clear that it does not want coalition at this time. It does not want a national government. And so, with that in mind, we have to then reach for the second best option, and that is a coalition government. In effect, we feel that we need to fight the election as a coalition, win the election, and then use that as a platform for a national government. So in order to get to a national government that includes the PPP, we have to remove the PPP from government. And we feel the chances of a coalition removing the PPP from government, as opposed to an individual party, are stronger. We, as a third party, we are not going to kill ourselves and believe that we can, on our own, win an election. That would be one of the great miracles of our time, if that were so. We feel that we do have support among the masses of people. We do have electoral support. We feel that. But we are not going to say that we could win an election with that. We are, we understand the PNC's position that it could win an election on its own. After all, it's a large party and it has large resources. It has name recognition and all of that. So we do not contend their assumption that they could win an election on their own. But what we would say is that the chances of them winning on their own would be less than winning as part of a large coalition.
Dr. Hines, on what specific conditions will the WPA rejoin the APNU?
Well, look, the APNU would have to convince us that it would become a democratic organization. That would be our first condition. It is no secret that we do not feel that the APNU under the last leadership was democratic. Often decisions were taken in government that the members of the APNU did not know of. We learned of it like other organizations, we learned of it in the press. We pleaded with the leadership that big issues, big policy issues should come before the coalition, and for the coalition, meaning come before the APNU, for the APNU to discuss, debate it, and make recommendations to the government. We made it very clear that the APNU grouping should not become a substitute for government, but that the member parties should be involved in discussion, because the government was making decisions in our names because we were part of the governing coalition. And despite that, there was a commission of inquiry set up by the leadership of the APNU to investigate our concerns. And that commission found that all the parties, including the PNC, complained of not being consulted. And so therefore, our first condition would be an organization that is run democratically and that operates in a democratic way, and that parties, regardless of their size, be given a voice to air their concerns. So that would be our first condition to rejoining the APNU. There are other issues, such as the coalition not being controlled by the big party. That was an issue that, they treated us as one party rather than several parties. And we feel that we cannot be part of such a dispensation, because although we may not necessarily automatically bring 100,000 votes into the coalition, we feel that we can influence 200,000 votes by our policies, by our political stances. So yes, there will be parties who, because of their name recognition and long history, could bring votes. There'll be parties who could not, in the first instance, bring votes, but they can influence votes to stay with the coalition, or influence those who would opt not to go to the polls and not to vote. We could influence them to go to vote. So we feel that if we go back in the APNU, it must not be dominated by a large party. And finally, a condition would be for the large party to keep its word. That once we agree on a course of action, that course of action must be respected. And so those would be our three conditions at the moment. I don't know if any of my comrades has anything to add. Brother Ogun, anything else?
No, I think you have dealt with it fairly extensively. But I only want to add that the WPA experience in the coalition was disappointing, because the masses expect from the WPA to provide a certain quality of leadership in the coalition, but in practical terms, we were, given the way the coalition was organized, its decision making, we could not influence policy in any timely way, okay? And this made a joke of popular democracy. And we wanted, we would want to ensure that this time around, and it's hard because these are not easy matters. You don't know the behavior of the others until after the fact. People could tell you anything, but then you know how they behave, because Granger, before the last elections, when we decided to raise all the fundamental issues with Granger, and one of the, I will just keep the comment to one, which was important, the way in which, you appoint our MP, and we came to an agreement that the WPA, will be the group that will choose its MP, and we will instruct the APMU, on that matter. It didn't happen that way. The Granger didn't keep that. He did his own thing. And he totally ignored what we wanted, and he used his power as the leader of the list and as the leader of the APMU to treat the matter like if, he was dealing with the PNC. And we don't want to subject ourselves to that behavior again.
Dr. Hines or Mr. Gunsey, the fact that you have not rejoined the APNU up to now, to what extent does this suggest that you have not got any concrete commitments and these conditions that you refer to?
I think you're correct. But just to say that we have not had any serious discussion of these issues that were raised by myself and Brother Ogun. I'm hesitant to say that we have not gotten any commitment because we have not discussed the issues yet. And so there's not been an opportunity for these commitments to be ruled on by us and the other members of the APNU.
Is there a time frame by which this will happen?
We cannot say we are ready. All I can say is that we are ready. We are ready for talks towards a coalition. We are ready. If we get the call tomorrow, we are ready to sit down with the PNC, the AFC, the other members of the APNU. We are prepared to sit down and begin discussions. We have been discussing these matters now for 4 years. After the last election, we embarked on a long discussion among our leaders and activists on these issues. So we are very, very clear and we are ready. We feel that these discussions should have been taking place a long time ago, but we are only one party.
Sir Mark DaCosta, Village Voice News. I would like to step back a bit to the position articulated by Dr. Hines in that the referendum would be conditional on second aspect, which would include how the monies would be spent. So it would include the Buxton proposal or any other means of how the revenues would be spent or disbursed. The first question on the referendum is probably going to be: should there be revisit of the PSA? And it would seem that that would be a straightforward question for a person to answer, for a citizen to answer. It would be a straightforward yes or no. The second part, on which Dr. Hines said support for the WPA's position on the referendum would hinge, may seem a bit more complex. May I ask, without maybe getting too granular or jumping ahead, how could such a question be included on the referendum with regard to, it would seem that that's not simple yes or no answer. How would such a question be framed? At this point, are there any thoughts about how the WPA may propose that such a question be framed on the referendum with regard to how the revenues are disbursed?
Thanks for the question, because you're quite right. It is a little bit more complex than the question on the PSA. But we would think that a question asking the citizens whether they feel that oil revenues should be dispersed annually to the citizens, or a fraction of the oil revenues, should a fraction of the oil revenues be dispersed annually to the Guyanese people. I think that would be a preliminary draft question. Now, we can play around with it, but that would be our preliminary draft question. And in the case of shared governance, we would also say, ask whether people believe that there should be a government of national unity, including all the representative parties of the people. But we do recognize that the question surrounding the cash transfers is going to take some more tweaking than the other two questions. But like I said, the basis of our position is the distribution of a fraction of the oil revenues annually, or some may say periodically. We would prefer annually, to the people of Guyana.
Thank you, Dr. Hines.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.